So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on whichever part of the world you're from. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar, which has been organized by the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition, which is being hosted by DNDi. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Priscilla Rupali. I'm an infectious disease physician from the Christian Medical College, Vellore in India. I have been dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic in my capacity as an infectious disease physician right from the onset of this pandemic, and have been responsible for making country-specific COVID guidelines for India. So we know that new and effective drug treatments are have become available, and while we have new treatments, we also have some monoclonal antibodies which have lost their efficacy due to the Omicron variants. In addition, many lower middle income countries have encountered issues of cost, access, and availability of these therapeutic agents. So today, the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition has convened experts to address some of these very important and pertinent questions. So just a little bit about the coalition. The coalition was formed in April 2020 by clinician researchers and scientists in their concern as a growing response to the impact that COVID-19 was causing all over the world. So the coalition leverages global expertise to advance high-impact COVID-19 research in low-middle income countries through its advisory and expert working groups. It advocates on the issues of concerns to its member countries. It promotes open sharing of research knowledge and data, and it champions equitable and affordable access to vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments that are proven effective. So if you're interested in joining this or want to learn more, do look for the links that we will be sharing in the chat. In addition, I'd like to bring to your notice another thing. Coalition has a newly formed therapeutics working group, which is co-chaired by Professor Sekou and Dr. Mauro Teixeira. The working group serves to provide an advisory role for the coalition and its extended networks, providing a platform for relevant COVID-19 therapeutic discussions. It also provides an advocacy role. It focuses on therapeutics research, and that we hope will generate the most relevant evidence for low-income country settings. It also aims to provide an up-to-date therapeutics knowledge and evidence generation, which would be applicable to the low research settings. You can find more information on about the working group on the coalition website, and we're hoping that with this event, we will be able to elaborate on what therapeutics research is now needed to inform policy making and research in the low-income country setting. So let's move on to the agenda now. So we have a list of excellent speakers for you today. You can see here Professor Guido Vanham, who is going to be talking to us on this current COVID-19 therapeutics landscape. We have Ms. Lina Mengene from the MSF Access Campaign. And we have Dr. Andrew Hill, who's going to be talking a little bit about costs. And last, Dr. Syed Faisal Mohammed, who will be talking to us about the current challenges of access, as well as what research can be done to inform policy. Before we start off, I'd like to kind of mention about the survey that has been done by the secretariats. So new therapeutics, as we all know, with proven efficacy are available, but access has remained a major issue, especially for those in the low-income country settings. So the coalition actually ran a survey over the summer to help gain more insight into the access for these medicines in different countries. And you can see here, these are the key points for the survey. You can see that on the left-hand side, 59 respondents from 37 countries and 15 from high-income countries, 44 from low and middle-income countries, and availability for 4 therapeutics was assessed. The ones which are available, you can see that there. And this was in stark contrast to the availability in high-income countries. So yes, the challenges were availability and access to many of them. Just a few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted later on the coalition website. Please ask questions via the Q&A tool that is there at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote any questions that you may have by clicking the thumbs up sign, and those were the ones which are going to be answered earlier. If you would like to address the question to the speaker in particular, be sure to include the speaker name with the question. The chat is open for any questions if you have any. So let me start off by introducing the first speaker. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Guido van Ham. He's a professor at the University of Antwerp in Belgium, but is also a consultant for the Belgian Federal Knowledge Center and for the Therapeutic Working Group of the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition. He'll be talking to us on what is the state of art in COVID-19 therapeutics. Over to you, Professor Guido.
Good afternoon. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the current therapeutics and give you some perspectives as well. So this is a general overview of different classes of potential drugs useful for COVID-19. You see on top the entry inhibitors, amongst those, of course, the monoclonal antibodies. Then the polymerase and protease inhibitors will block the enzymes of the virus and thus block the viral cycle. And then there's a whole range of inhibitors of cytokine storm and hyperinflammation. We have to look at the course of the disease, of course, and as we know, in the beginning of the disease, there is extensive viral replication, it's called so-called viral phase with a flu-like syndrome. But if the disease progresses to more severe disease, inflammation comes on the foreground and leads to complications such as ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and various systemic complications as well. Now, conceptually, the therapeutic options are usual care, and that's not unimportant, to provide oxygen to those who need, but also to combat fever, to ensure fluid balance, to support vital functions, to treat superinfections, and anticoagulants if needed. Now, with regard to the specific antivirals, there is the polymerase inhibitors remdesivir to be given intravenously and molnupiravir orally. And as protease inhibitors, the most prominent one is Paxlovid, which is a combination of nirmatrelvir with ritonavir. And there are the neutralizing antibodies. Next, you have the inflammatory phase, where prominently corticosteroids, antibodies to the interleukin-6 receptor, and oral JAK-STAT inhibitors have their merits. So, next slide. Well, okay. So the first class are these polymerase and protease inhibitors. And I just show you here the results of the important phase 3 trials that were published earlier this year in the New England Journal. So it's all in non-hospitalized but high-risk patients. Most of them, more than 90%, were non-vaccinated, and it's all in the pre-Omicron era. As you can see, intravenous remdesivir has a very significant 81% effect on reduction of hospitalization or death, whereas oral molnupiravir has a lower effect of only 30% in this trial, and oral Paxlovid is the champion with a reduction of almost 90%. Now, remdesivir has also been trialed in hospitalized patients. In fact, it shortened time to recovery. It reduced also mortality in another trial, but the effect was most pronounced in non-critical patients, so those who did not require oxygen or only low levels of oxygen. It was not so clear in people who required high flow oxygen or mechanical ventilation. And the effect is much less pronounced than the effect we have just seen in non-hospitalized patients. So these are the indications for these three drugs according to the European Medicine Agency. I will not go into the details, you can read them, but importantly, they have to be administered early, within 5 or 7 days after symptoms onset. Next are the anti-inflammatory and anti-cytokine drugs for severe COVID. So dexamethasone was the first one with proven success in severe hospitalized patients. So it lowered mortality at 28 days in patients requiring oxygen, and even more so in patients who were ventilated. That's this graph here, and those are the ones requiring oxygen. Whereas the effect in no oxygen requirement was much less pronounced, if anything. So it's a bit a mirror image of the effect of remdesivir that was more prominent in non-critical patients. So tocilizumab, the anti-interleukin-6 receptor monoclonal, has also a clear-cut effect on mortality in the left panel, and on shortening the stay in the hospital in patients with hypoxia and systemic inflammation. And finally, the JAK inhibitor, baricitinib, in severe or critical patients, was clearly reducing mortality and had also a clear-cut trend in reducing progression to mechanical ventilation. So all these results and many other trials and real-world experience led to the present guidelines of WHO. And WHO subdivides, it's updated on a regular basis through the British Medical Journal, subdivides the patients in non-severe, severe, and critical patients according to WHO criteria. Now, in non-severe patients, and especially in those at high risk of progression, being elderly or having various comorbidities, there is a strong recommendation to use the Paxlovid combination, nirmatrelvir and ritonavir. Whereas in severe and critical patients, the just mentioned anti-inflammatory and anti-cytokine drugs, corticosteroids, interleukin-6 receptor blockers, and baricitinib should be combined according to these guidelines. Now, with regard to molnupiravir and remdesivir, as you can see, the recommendation is less strong. There's the sum of all trials, etc., is less convincing, as in the case of Paxlovid. But remdesivir can also be used, as we have seen, in severe patients, although it has a less clear effect in severe patients than in non-severe patients. Importantly as well is that WHO has a lot of caution, in fact, and advises against the use of corticosteroids in non-severe patients, and in these JAK inhibitors in severe patients, because they have not yet been sufficiently trialed, but most likely they have the same effect as baricitinib. Now, with regard to ivermectin, that has been used extensively, fluvoxamine, convalescent plasma, as you can see, it is not recommended, only could only be used in the setting of clinical trials. And for the time being, remdesivir is also not advised in critical patients. And there is strong recommendation against the use of colchicine, convalescent plasma in non-severe patients, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, which has been used in the beginning, and also the monoclonal antibodies, because, as has already been mentioned, most of them have lost activity against several Omicron variants. So finally, there are some promising drugs on the horizon that have not yet found their place in the guidelines because they have not been trialed enough at this moment. So that's ancit-relvir, which is a protease inhibitor being developed in Japan, which has the advantage that it's non-peptidic and that it doesn't need the addition of ritonavir, which causes a lot of drug-drug interactions. And sabuzabulin, which has an effect a bit like colchicine, but which seems to be much more pronounced. And in one phase 3 trial, which has been published in New England, had very rather dramatic effects on the inflammatory phase. So that's it for the time being. I can show you more results in the end if you want, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Guido, for that wonderful summary of the various drugs that are available for treatment of COVID-19. It's my pleasure to now introduce Ms. Lina Mengene. Ms. Lina Mengene is a lawyer who's working with the MSF Access campaign with a focus on public health, intellectual property rights, and access to treatment. Over to you, Ms. Lina.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. So just a disclaimer over there. I've worked with the pharmacist team and other working groups in MSF during the pandemic, looking at the therapies that were becoming available and looking at the availability for own projects and of course beyond. So I'm just going to really state some of the problems which perhaps many of you are already familiar with. The first, of course, is that moment you have a pandemic or an outbreak, you have the capture of supplies by high-income countries. This happened in H1N1 as well with Roche's oseltamivir. It subsequently was very well reflected in this pandemic, where if you look at the more recent treatment of nirmatrelvir, 10 million doses were immediately picked up by the United States government, while other governments were still struggling to access the treatment. And most importantly, the rest of the low and middle income countries were basically told that you have to wait till generic competition sets in from regions like South Asia, Bangladesh, India, and other regions. So you really have a clear capture of supplies by high-income countries. This can happen with repurposed treatments. It can happen with newer treatments. And it's been a clear trend that we've seen in right through the last 2 decades. Then you have the biosimilars, as we say, the MABs. I've worked on trastuzumab, which is a drug for breast cancer, and all of us are struck into the high prices and how inaccessible it was for patients in India and many other countries. And what we saw in the pandemic was really very interesting. Roche had a certain supply of tocilizumab. We had to negotiate as MSF for months to get a small supply of tocilizumab. And by the time the supply comes in, already the recommendations have changed and we've had to look at disposing of the drug. So really waste of MSF's resources. And of course, the fact that, treatment providers, particularly in humanitarian context, have to negotiate drug by drug, pharmaceutical company by company. It has been something that has, sort of set back our response for our own patients and staff. So I just wanted to sort of highlight the problem of high prices with biosimilars, where you see, each dose of tocilizumab in India during the Delta wave selling at 600 and above a vial, basically making it more accessible for richer Indians, but also the issue of non-registration and lack of supplies for other lower middle income countries being a really big, important problem, because in the space of biological medicines, in certain cases, you have monopolies, either by design, which is patents, or either, competition is yet to set in and suppliers are yet to come into the market. And we saw that clear mismatch during the waves that we saw in South Asia, for example. So supplies to countries did not come when they were needed most. This is really very important. We've seen that, at least I've seen that firsthand in India, but I'm sure others who lived through the different waves have probably seen this firsthand as well. We've seen a major supply problem to countries like Latin America, for example, who struggled with accessing the drugs from manufacturing countries and, of course, pharma companies. Latin America is particularly vulnerable to being left out of any responses that have been set up, for example, voluntary licenses. And you can really see that, what you have is a supplier who's pricing the drug very high and, of course, prioritizing high-income countries over middle-income and low-income countries. You have ACT-A supporting governments to procure therapies, and of course, some progress has been made, and ACT-A's therapeutic pillar has made significant progress. We've also, of course, been consulting with those partners, but what we really have realized is for humanitarian actors such as Medicines Sans Frontieres, supplies to organizations like us who worked particularly in very vulnerable contexts, we were not included in the agreements. Treatment providers like us were not envisaged in the agreements between Acte and of course Acte partners and companies like Roche and Pfizer. So we had to do separate negotiations with the companies, losing very valuable time. And the companies basically said that Acte would be supporting governments, and supplies to Acte would be meant, these agreements would cover governments but would not cover treatment providers. So that led to a significant delay for treatment providers like MSF. We also had companies like Pfizer insisting on indemnity and NDAs. The non-disclosure agreements became the first step towards even discussing price and supplies, which is a significant hurdle, not only in the vaccine space, but also in the COVID therapeutic space. Signing a non-disclosure agreement, not sharing the price with our donors and countries and people would have been a major setback for MSF, who's been publishing prices of important therapeutics for several decades. And of course, the NDA then becomes a stumbling block to discussing supplies for various countries and the prices henceforth. We've seen some progress where generic competition has sort of been, placed on the table as a solution to monopolies, and the fact that generic companies could sublicense the manufacture and supply of the product through agencies such as the Medicines Patent Pool. We saw some of these voluntary licenses come into place earlier this year and late last year. And what we see is that major regions have been left out of those voluntary licenses. Therefore, those countries like Brazil and other Latin American countries would then have to work with a patent holder to get access and supplies, even as those corporations would prioritize high-income countries. I would just like to highlight as a lawyer that instead of having very complex negotiations and very complex agreements, a non-assert would be a better approach, where companies would agree to not assert the intellectual property in a pandemic, and of course governments would provide protection against the assertion of intellectual properties. I would also like to sort of highlight that in the space of small oral drugs, molecules, intellectual property can play a major role. And this is going to be my last point. When JAK inhibitors came in, there was a sort of a relief that we didn't have to depend just on tocilizumab for severe patients. And what we saw that, baricitinib, and I'm sure Dr. Hill will present the prices over there. From India, of course, they were available at less than $7 a treatment, as compared to Eli Lilly's $2,300 a treatment. And what we saw was that intellectual property was a major hurdle. We saw companies in India push to enter the market, trying to utilize compulsory licenses. And eventually Eli Lilly, sort of waived the intellectual property only for India. So therefore, you had these sources of medicines emerge from India, which could be very quickly validated in terms of quality. But then, of course, they could not be exported out of India. So intellectual property can prove to be a major hurdle, and of course, was not included in the first set of agreement on the TRIPS waiver, which was on intellectual property waivers. And of course, lastly, what we see is this: there's a lack of political will for compulsory licenses, and there was no combined position of governments to say that intellectual property should not be asserted. Of course, South Africa and India made a proposal to the World Trade Organization, but that didn't go far in terms of therapeutics. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for having me in this webinar.
Thank you so much, Ms. Leena, and we look forward to kind of hearing more from you with regard to various other issues with regard to access. So it's my pleasure to introduce the third speaker now. Dr. Andrew Hill is a senior visiting fellow at the University of Liverpool, and he specializes in clinical trials of antiviral drugs and also works on access to medicines. Dr. Andrew Hill, over to you.
Thanks very much. So I was working on treatment of COVID right from the start of the epidemic in early 2020 with Unitaid as part of the ACTA collaboration. The challenge at the time was to produce a treatment which would cost around $5 per person and could be upscaled and given to millions of people within a short space of time. Now, if we look at how we normally, one slide back, please. If we look at how we normally estimate how treatments could be mass produced at low cost, this is based on HIV or hepatitis, other viral diseases. The first thing we have is a recommendation that the treatment works based on high quality evidence. We'll look at how many people might need the treatment, for how long. We then look at how much the drugs cost to make, the raw ingredients, and then contracts are made with generic suppliers with coordinated central funding. It was very hard to do that, and it remains very hard to do that for COVID-19 for various reasons. Firstly, a lot of the evidence can be very low quality. We can have evidence from non-randomized studies. Some studies are actually made up. We have several cases of medical fraud, of very poor quality data. Some clinical trials show results that suggesting a treatment works for unvaccinated people before the era of COVID. You do the same trial for vaccinated people after COVID, and the drug doesn't work any longer. You can think that a drug works for a large number of people, then you have to re-estimate it for a smaller number of people because the treatment no longer works in the new era. So this is a very difficult thing to do. I'm going to talk about the treatments which are currently, oh, sorry, one back again. The treatments that are currently recommended by WHO. So as we were hearing earlier from Guido, for high-risk outpatients with at least a 10% risk of hospitalization, either Pfizer's Paxlovid or Merck's molnupiravir. Now, even people with at least 10% risk of hospitalization, that is a very small number of people, typically elderly, unvaccinated people with comorbidities. So this is a niche indication with a small demand. For severe COVID, dexamethasone, remdesivir to some extent. For critical, baricitinib, tocilizumab, sarilumab. But let's look at the evidence underlying even these recommendations and see how quickly things can change and how hard it is actually to make these estimations. So we've looked at how much the treatments cost versus what they're priced at. It's safe to say that the treatments are sold at a very high premium to their cost price in high-income countries. There are arrangements for drugs to be made available more cheaply elsewhere. However, if we look at the evidence underlying these treatments, if imagine a country wanted to use nirmatrelvir or Pfizer's Paxlovid, only 23% of the key data has even been published. So we don't know about a lot of the evidence that underlies the recommendation. The EPIC-HR study was in unvaccinated people pre-Omicron. It showed an improvement in hospitalization, but those are not the patients that we see nowadays. Most people now are vaccinated and they're infected with variants of COVID, which lead to less severe disease. There was a second study, EPIC-HSR, mainly in unvaccinated people. It failed. It failed in its primary outcome. It was never published, even a year after being completed. And that's a very unfortunate situation. It shouldn't be accepted that a company can withhold publication for that length of time. There's a prevention trial of Paxlovid which failed. There's an Oxford panoramic follow-up study with no results. So for Paxlovid, what do we really know about the drug? No trials in late-stage hospitalized patients, a limited study of vaccinated patients, and we've heard that Pfizer has actually blocked the initiation of independent trials, for example, with DNDi to evaluate Paxlovid. We then go on to molnupiravir. The molnupiravir move-in study in hospitalized patients was stopped by an ethics committee after more people died taking molnupiravir than placebo. The move-out trial in outpatients showed a borderline significant result that was very strange. The drug worked in early stages of the trial and then showed worse outcomes in later stages of the trial. The move-ahead trial has never been published. There are 12 Indian trials of molnupiravir with no results published, and that's 13,000 people. And it looks like some of those are at risk of medical fraud. You then look at the Oxford panoramic trial, which was just announced. There's absolutely no difference, no benefit for molnupiravir for hospitalization or death, 0.8% in each arm. A small difference in recovery trial times, but this is an open label study. This could partly be a placebo effect. And there's no difference in recovery in a double-blinded trial. And normally for subjective endpoints like recovery, you would trust the results of a double-blinded study over an open label study. So it's not clear whether molnupiravir is of any benefit. It's not approved in Europe, and it's just been rejected in the UK by NICE, the cost effectiveness group. There's an additional problem, even when you're doing demand forecasts, of getting anybody treated with any antiviral within 4 days. For example, if somebody on a Monday realized they had the symptoms of COVID, they'd have to realize that's what it was and not a cold or influenza or something else. They'd have to look for a test. Tests are generally charged for in most countries now. They've got to get an appointment with a doctor. The doctor needs to realize this is the disease and start treatment. In most countries, if not all countries worldwide, this is almost impossible outside a clinical trial setting. So then we go on to costs of drugs for severe or critical disease. Now, dexamethasone was the early success. That's the drug which did show a reduction in death rates, as Guido was saying earlier on. We have remdesivir, which looked as if it was successful and then failed in the WHO's Solidarity trial. And it's generally not recommended in most settings, except for a small niche of people who are hospitalized and oxygenated. Baricitinib is a drug which can be produced very, very cheaply, as Lena was suggesting, $4 for a course of treatment. Tocilizumab, the monoclonal antibody, still remains expensive in most countries, and there isn't a clear pathway to make it cheaply. But the combination of dexamethasone and baricitinib seems to be most preferable. We've looked at how much remdesivir could cost to make. It could cost about $10 for a 10-day course, but it's not clear whether it actually provides a benefit. Here's tocilizumab costs by country. So you get the usual range, $3,400 in US pharmacies, down to $500 in Pakistan. But this is nowhere near the original target of a $5 treatment. So monoclonals looked as if they were working, and then the shape of the variants changed, and the FDA no longer recommends sotrovimab, nor does the WHO. All of the monoclonals have basically lost favor and are very rarely used. Pegylated interferon lambda is a drug at a research stage. It might work, and it could be produced quite cheaply for $3 per vial if the patent restrictions could be removed. So just to conclude, really, if you look at the challenge of producing drugs for COVID, it's been extremely hard because the evidence underlying them has proved to be unreliable. And we've seen many cases of drugs looking good and then just failing. There are really only two treatments that are both affordable and providing consistent benefits: dexamethasone and baricitinib. $1 for dexamethasone, $4 for baricitinib. The drugs in the outpatients are unfortunately mainly a failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions for you in the chat. Let's move on to our fourth speaker, Dr. Faisal Mahmood. Dr. Faisal Mahmood is an associate professor, and he's a section head for infectious diseases at the Aga Khan University Hospital in Pakistan. Dr. Faisal Mahmood, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So my work is actually cut out because a lot of the things that we've done, that we've spoken about, I'm just going to sort of recap them and reshape them into a format which puts it all together. But a quick recap, we already know that LICs and LMICs really lag behind when it comes to access to therapeutics. And just as an example, if you look at, for example, cancer care, we know that even though 70% of cancers occur in these areas, only 15% of people have access to cancer therapy. And then even in infectious diseases, if you look at new drugs coming in, so you can see, for example, the first figure shows countries where new drugs are coming in, red being the least number of drugs coming in. And on the other hand, you have resistance. And over here, you can see red are the places where you have the most resistance, where these drugs are needed. So it's not surprising that COVID-19 is the same, where LICs and LMICs got the drugs late or not at all. Lena went over why this may be, and I'm just going to sort of put together. But before we do that, we should know what access means. When we say there's no access, what are we talking about? And actually, it's actually a huge, long list of things which lead to access. And these are all the domains of access, which then will allow the drugs to come to the community, to the hospitals, to the individuals, either national or even provincial level. So a lot of these things play together to lead to good access. And I'm just going to share a couple of examples of how access issues related to COVID. And we've already spoken about some of these. For example, we discussed how there was the vaccine and treatment nationalism because of global protectionism. So the high-income countries sort of stockpiling the antivirals as soon as they came out. And Lina gave some really good examples of these, of capture of supplies. She also mentioned TRIPS, or the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which do further restrict manufacturing, even though, I mean, there are some advantages of TRIPS also, because it sort of makes drug companies sort of want to develop drugs. And we also mentioned, or she briefly mentioned, the MPP, which is the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a UN-backed, not agency, but group, which can then get the patents. And then now 30 countries have signed deals with them to produce at least Paxlovid. But remember, even if an LMIC can produce drugs, it doesn't mean they're going to have access to it, because there are a lot of issues with production. There's lack of capital when it comes to production. There's low quality and standards. There are weak enabling policy frameworks within these countries to begin with. And then the markets are small in LICs and LMICs with very unstable demand, which sort of puts more pressure on drug companies not to produce them. And then this, along with poor infrastructure, makes, even if an LIC or MIC can make a drug, they may not be, or have the patents, they may not want to make the drug. Other issues that we deal with or have dealt with COVID is accessibility and affordability. And Andrew went over a lot about the affordability, but keep in mind, accessibility has also been an issue, especially with lockdowns early on. And then now there's no way of moving drugs from country to country through sort of established pathways. So there's no global network of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Drug companies, the drug prices are inflated. And Lina spoke about how this may lead to disparities, even within countries where the rich can afford the drugs, but the poor cannot. There's also issues with accessibility within the countries because of poor health systems. Poor health systems really has led to poorly studied drugs getting flooded in the markets. For example, favipiravir got flooded in the market in a lot of countries, even before any of the trials came out, just because it was cheap to get. Remdesivir is available in many countries, but getting them IV is a problem. And then cold chain may be an issue. And don't forget, there are regional challenges also. For example, conflict-stricken areas like war-ridden areas. And a lot of LMICs and LICs have rural areas where even though the drug may be present in the country, but they can't really move to the rural areas where they may be required. Innovation is something that I will talk about in the end a little bit, but remember, there is a concentration of R&D in HICs and not really LMICs, and there's really poor R&D in these areas. And this leads to exploitation, so where high-income countries may actually do drug trials in these countries in LICs and LMICs, but after the trial is done, the access is lost to the drugs. And then almost finally, you have things like accessibility, adoption, and appropriateness, because even when new drugs come out, there may be issues with acceptability. So we face this over here all the time, where, you know, when we know these drugs work in patients who are really early in disease, but a lot of patients don't feel that they need the drug because they're not really that sick. And the timing of the drug, Andrew went over how even if you have access, you may not be able to give it to whoever needs it. And then adoption of new drug and inappropriate, that's a misprint, not appropriate, inappropriate lead use does lead to poor allocation, where, for example, once a drug is available, because they may be used in the wrong population, for example, in the very severely sick, antivirals may be used, so the people who really need it may not get it. So just to end up, what are possible solutions? So capacity building is one, and capacity building for manufacturing in LICs and LMICs. And this goes beyond COVID to future pandemics or even non-pandemic situations where you need to have investment in skill development, providing incentives for drug manufacturing so that you can stimulate the market, and then streamline regulation, because it's really hard to go through all the red tapeism to start any manufacturing in these countries. Similarly, you have to build capacity for research, so which means that you ensure a partnership in research, not just companies coming in and doing the trials here, but actually have this as a two-way partnership, or have the LMICs have a say in the trial itself, and then also ensure that post-trial there are licenses awarded, and then build R&D capacity within these countries so they can run their own studies. And then finally, increasing pharmaceutical involvement. And an example of this is, and this actually is happening thanks to COVID in some ways, where the 2022 Access to Medicine Index, which looks at how much pharmaceutical companies are engaged, has now finally showed that in 6 companies, at least, they have access plans for voluntary licensing after the trial is done. And this is not just for COVID, this is for things beyond COVID as well. But it shows that at least some gains are being made in this direction. Thank you.
So thank you to all the speakers. I can already see a lot of questions in the chat box. A few announcements. Attendees can raise their hands and they can be unmuted to ask their questions. You can discuss and ask questions in the chat box as well, but make sure that your message goes to all panelists and attendees. So let's go on to discuss some of the questions in the chat box. I can see that some questions have already been answered. I'm going to address my first question to Professor Guido. Professor Guido, there's a question from Dr. Mary, who has mentioned that there has been some controversy with regard to remdesivir. So according to some publications, it has shown no significant therapeutic effects. However, in this presentation, you talked about the utility of remdesivir in hospitalized patients. Dr. Guido.
Yeah, well, I think it was also addressed by Andrew Hill's talk. In fact, most published results with remdesivir show a beneficial effect, at least when you apply it early on. But there is suspicion that not all the results, not all the real-world results were really published. And of course, from the perspective of low and middle income countries, it has the disadvantage of intravenous administration, which is very difficult to realize early on in the disease. So it is, according to WHO, a second choice drug at this moment, certainly for low and middle income countries.
Thank you, Professor Guido. The next question I'd like to direct to is Dr. Andrew Hill. Dr. Andrew Hill, many of the therapeutic trials that occurred for COVID-19 seem to be fragmented with varying results. What do you think would be the best approach for therapeutics research coordination for the next pathogen X that may come along?
Okay, I think first of all, we've got to start disregarding the results from real life studies. People have published results from non-randomized cohort studies where everything works: aspirin, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, molnupiravir, etc. And the same drugs in randomized studies don't work. So real life studies really need to be put to one side. We need to have more large randomized trials, platform studies with the same approach as WHO Solidarity or the UK panoramic studies, principal studies, the NIH Act 6 trial, or the Together trials. It's these large platform studies in thousands of patients that can give us the answers. And I think people have made too many conclusions from small fragmented trials, some of which unfortunately didn't even exist. They were fraud. So we need a lot more emphasis on quality and large consolidated studies.
Sure, that's a great answer. My third question I'd like to direct to Dr. Mahmood. Dr. Mahmood, the clinical development pathway for innovations in COVID-19 was at unprecedented speed. So what do you think was the biggest catalyst for the clinical development pathways for COVID-19 therapeutics?
Thank you. I hope I'm a little wonky. But the main driver was that really there was no therapeutics at all. This was completely new, and hence that was probably the biggest for the development. But I agree, it was very fragmented, and really I see no hopes that there will be any different for the next pandemic unless something is done about quickly.
Okay, would any of the other speakers like to add on anything to this particular question? Dr. Hill, perhaps?
No, I think that answered very well.
Okay. I'm going to address my next question to Professor Guido again. Thank you for the great presentation on therapeutic options. Is there anything in long COVID that's on the horizon?
Well, unfortunately, the picture is even more murky in long COVID, of course, because you have so many different symptoms, and the pathogenesis in most cases is not very clear. So lots of things have been tried, but without clear success. So of course there is a lot of, especially in UK, in United States, and Germany, you have long COVID clinics where multidisciplinary teams try to see each patient's condition and then go for a combination of physiotherapy, psychological support, training, and some supportive medicine according to the symptoms. But there is certainly at this moment no magic bullet, and it is obviously much too late for antiviral drugs at that stage.
Thank you, Professor Guido. I'm going to address my next question to Lena. Lena, there's a question: how should industry, pharma, therapeutics researchers balance the cost of medicines and ensure sustainability of resources?
You know, it's a challenging question because pharma is shaping everything around therapeutics. When they're available, what's the prices, how much supply comes into the market. And we have to realize there's a power imbalance among, between governments and people and the pharmaceutical corporations who control these medicines, and how they reach people in particularly in low and middle income countries. And I think this is where I think there's this understanding now starting to grow that we need much more sustainable manufacturing and spread out manufacturing across the world regionally. And I think much more effort is being made in Africa. You can see the Latin Americans are pretty serious about it. You are seeing other alternative producers also coming up. But all the challenges that Faisal Mahmood highlighted, that you need government subsidies, you need government support, you need infrastructure, you need platforms to do bioequivalence and other quality assurance mechanisms. All of those have to be put in. And I think if you want to undo the equation that we've seen where I would say that the pharmaceutical industry has pretty much dictated the prices of many of these therapies, which were not old, but the ones that we needed in the pandemic, like baricitinib. Then we have to change the way we look at the way the market is shaped, and it shouldn't be shaped just by the industry. And they shape not only the way the medicines are supplied in a pandemic or a non-pandemic situation, they also shape what is available to researchers. For example, if you need the medicine to run a clinical trial, you are heavily dependent on the company to give you the supplies. I think governments need to step in and solve that problem. Similarly, if you need the reference product to do a bioequivalence testing, you can't get the samples unless Pfizer or the originator gives it to you. And that's where WHO needs to start worrying about what are we going to do about reference products when you have alternative suppliers coming into the market. I think the pandemic has opened all of these discussions and more on the market and market forces. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lina. Next question is addressed to Dr. Mahmood. Dr. Mahmood, the question is, IV administration of drugs in low-income countries is feasible and routine, and for example, antimalarials are routinely administered when required. So what is your comment on this particular question?
So I agree with you. IV, and it's not like we can't give IV in LMICs. I mean, and LICs, we do it all the time over here, also in Pakistan. But it's not the same as prescribing a medication. So it is a little bit of it is not easy to get the drip sets arranged, get it home. And it's somebody who's already in isolation who may not be freely mobile. So that does become an access issue, and sometimes it also becomes an issue of who can afford to have somebody come in and put the IV line and get the drugs in. So so it is definitely a burden. It's not undoable, but if, for example, if Paxlovid is available or a drug is available, which can just be delivered and taken by oral, that makes much more sense.
Thank you. Dr. Guido, an interesting question in the chat is, there are many antivirals that are known that could work for many of the RNA viruses. So why is it that it's been difficult for SARS-CoV-2? And is there something in the molecular mechanism that is peculiar that prevented us initially to be able to get drugs out quickly?
No, in fact, remdesivir existed before COVID. Molnupiravir also existed before COVID, and it was shown early on in the lab that those drugs and in animal models that those drugs were active. So nirmatrelvir is a new development, but it's based on similar drugs in HIV and hepatitis C. So it's certainly not undoable. I think the problem is that we stressed it several times. This is an acute infection. You have to treat very early to have an effect on the course of the disease, because after a while the disease is taken over by hyperinflammation, and so it's a very different condition than, for instance, HIV or hepatitis C, which are chronic diseases where you can suppress the virus and relieve the progression of the disease. You see, and hepatitis C, of course, can be cured. So in principle, SARS-CoV could also be cured with antivirals in vitro and in some models. But you just come in practice too late. That's the point. That's the whole point. And it has been equally difficult to develop real world drugs for influenza. In vitro you can kill influenza, but in human persons it is more difficult to be there in time.
Yes, I agree. I think we have another interesting question. I'm going to direct it to Dr. Andrew Hill. Could publishers do more to control quality? Even some ex-post checking and then name and shame. What do you think? Is that something that we could do, or could we have some disincentives that could prevent them from publishing fraudulent data?
Yeah, I think there are various things here. I mean, first of all, any study that's not randomized needs to be labeled as not randomized, so people can understand that it's a lower quality of evidence. Regulatory authorities will use high quality randomized clinical trials to make decisions on approval. Now, if we look at the randomized trials, there is a set of conditions that trials have to pass to be considered high quality. There's the Cochrane risk of bias calculator, and there's the consort checklist. Every publisher needs to insist that those are filled in and have access to raw data. So it was only when the raw data that was seen for studies for hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, for example, people could realize it was fraud straight away. If you don't have the raw data, editors can walk into a trap where they will seemingly publish a study showing a benefit that doesn't exist. We looked at the raw data from some of these studies. It was shocking. You had the same patient being cut and pasted again and again. You just had multiple patients. You had people who died before the study had even started. But it's only when we saw the raw data that we could see how flawed some of these trials were. So there's a lot of responsibility for the editors. And if a regulatory authority is looking at a trial, they would insist on the raw data. So we could see a difference between those two.
Great, thank you for that. My next question is to Lena. So Lena, limited resources we know will always put LMIC communities at a disadvantage. So apart from advocacy, what are the other solutions that LMICs could call upon to improve access?
LMICs really need a more coordinated approach, both regionally and globally. I mean, they'll always get left behind in an emergency such as, COVID. And, one of the challenges that really came out very clearly is this, that high-income countries were willing to pay much higher prices than what low and middle-income countries could actually afford to pay. And I think this is where I think a lot of the discussions on the pandemic treaty are going to be very, very interesting. How are we going to address those issues? We don't really have those answers, because in every single situation, we've seen the same power equation play out. So I think a lot of this is going to be discussed in the pandemic treaty about how to address those issues. And I think the negotiators for low and middle income countries, should insist upon more equitable distribution of all resources, medical supplies across in an emergency. And I think it's going to be some very interesting discussions going forward. Second thing is, I think everyone sort of, as I said before, the realization has sort of seeped in that, besides, the big pharmaceutical corporations who are making these medicines, and India and China who are making these medicines, there needs to be much more sustainable production across the world, regionally speaking. And lastly, I think, unfinished business, as I would always say, is that we've started to do much more progress on oral therapies, small molecules, but we have long way on access to the biological drugs that we need for cancer, for COVID. We've seen a huge mismatch in the manner in which biological medicines have been handled, and we don't really have all those answers. But I think more comprehensive regional, global discussions about what we're going to do about expensive biological medicines, starting from the WHO, changing the pathways for registration of biosimilars. All of those are important issues, I think. Lastly, you need civil society. I think we were missing, I think a lot of, in country, and I'm not saying globally, Brooke Baker and many other activists globally were active, but if you look in the countries, we were struggling to respond as civil society. We were not in the meetings. We were not in the advisory groups. We were not included in any of the government decision making that went on. We were all left out of very important decisions that our governments made. And COVID did that to us. We were outside the room, so therefore we couldn't influence or challenge, for example, some of the decisions that were made on what therapies should go into our guidelines, or what prices we are paying, or why should we sign non-disclosure agreements over vaccines or drugs. So I think civil society's role should be brought back in emergencies such as the pandemic. You can't leave communities that are most affected completely outside the decision-making process.
Thank you so much. I'm going to address my next question to Professor Mahmood. So there's a lot of research for interventions that was done for acute COVID in the high-income countries. So since long COVID is something that has been described a lot from the high-income countries, how do we get therapeutics enabled in low-income countries for long COVID?
So thank you. So long COVID is a little bit of a challenge, not just because its burden is really not clear. A lot of people with long COVID don't really come across and tell the symptoms. I saw somebody just today in the clinic who's had long COVID for a year, and this is the first time she's seeing a physician for it. But also long COVID is not one syndrome, unlike COVID itself, which is sort of easier, as we wrote very nicely went over the different stages. And the symptoms are so varied, and that the treatment probably is going to be varied as well. So I think long COVID is difficult. There are some large groups now looking at long COVID and publishing on it. Some looking at LMICs as well. But you're right. I think long COVID is a challenge. I'm not sure how we would bring access to care to LMICs when, to begin with, like any other chronic illness, other access is limited, and even in HICs, it's not clear how to treat it. Guido has his hand up.
Yeah, please go ahead, Professor Guido, because anyway, I think the
No,
next question
I
is for
want-
you.
Okay. Yeah, but I want to be sure we had a discussion before the meeting by email to stress really what I called in my first slide the usual care. I mean, we have put into perspective all these fancy drugs, shown that they are not so active in reality, that they cost a lot. And their accessibility, etc. But many people in high-income countries were saved before any of these drugs was available because we had good ICU units, good, well-trained personnel, oxygen, and all the drugs you need for people with acute respiratory distress syndrome. Of course, some of them died, nevertheless, but many were saved, and there is a huge gap also in the possibilities of low and middle income countries to organize such settings on a scale that was needed for this epidemic, and so I think we should stress this as well, because this is not only true for COVID, it is true for bad influenza, for pneumococci, for any severe respiratory or systemic disease, and access to that kind of care, to those means, to training personnel, is much more important than getting access to remdesivir, for instance, or to tocilizumab. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent answer. I think that's answered the questions for many. It was an issue of access, and in fact, even in India, we had long queues to shops for remdesivir, and people were selling their land for tocilizumab. It was a ridiculous situation. So thank you for putting that into perspective. And there is a question for you, Professor Guido. Has there been any evidence that if you treat early with antivirals, that it may actually defer long COVID, or you may not end up with long COVID if you use antivirals early? Is there any evidence at all?
Well, there is some evidence that vaccination can prevent to some extent long COVID, but the various studies are very different. I mean, the preventive effect of vaccination ranges from 0 to 80% according to the study. I'm not aware whether early treatment and whether there is sufficient evidence to say that could block long COVID. I don't know. So vaccination has certainly an effect, be it limited, in fact, but I'm not sure about antivirals. I don't know whether anybody else has any information on that. No.
I think you're right. I think it's about vaccination. And that's been the great story from COVID. Vaccination has been amazingly successful, but the treatments have been quite disappointing, apart from dexamethasone, baricitinib.
Okay, that's been an excellent question answer session. I'm going to direct my last question to Andrew. Andrew, I'm going to combine two questions into one. So how does the coordinated approach look for the global good? And we know that many centers, many countries develop their own pandemic preparedness. So is there something that we can use globally that would help each and every country? Is it possible? I do know that there are organizations like CEPI. I think Liverpool, has a pandemic center as well, if I'm not mistaken. So is there some coordinated approach that can come about, which would be helpful globally to prepare us for the next pandemic?
I think during the pandemic, there were examples that were set up that unfortunately weren't always repeated. We had the WHO solidarity trials that should have continued, been expanded, looked at other drugs. That didn't happen. We need more of those. I think the coordination of tracking variants has been excellent. Looking at different countries, disease severity, that's been good. And I think that underpins the pandemic preparedness, because the nightmare situation now is that we get a new variant that is can evade immune systems, can be vaccine resistant and treatment resistant. We've already seen the resistance against the monoclonal antibody treatments. Mercifully, so far, the new variants have not been more severe. But I think people have this myth that viruses get milder and milder over time. We haven't seen that with HIV. We haven't seen that with viral hepatitis. And influenza sometimes comes back more severe. So I think people are feeling right now that everything's fine because it's getting more mild for the moment. We've got to be ready in the future. And I think this combination of international collaborations on high quality randomized trials and tracking the variants is the way to do it.
Okay. So I think we're done with most of the questions. There's a question with regard to the efficacy of chloroquine and whether it would still be considered as a drug, as a therapeutic option. Professor Guido, maybe just a very short answer, yes or no?
No, it's very clear. Very
Okay.
clear.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I don't see any questions in the chat box anymore. Yeah, I think we can wind up. If there's no other comments, any other comments from the panelists or the speakers? Any last words of wisdom? So I think we'll finish up and wrap up. I think there have been excellent presentations from all the 4 speakers, a very good interaction from the audience here. And I think few simple key points to take away, as Professor Guido mentioned. You don't really need expensive interventions. We have cheaper ones. We have dexamethasone, we have baricitinib, we have oxygen, and that will go a long way towards treatment wherever you are, whether in a low middle income country, low income country, or high income country. It's important to pay attention to the publications and then deriving your own conclusions from them. Look for robust methodology. Always think in terms of whether the trial was randomized, whether appropriate precautions were taken with regard to sample size and to the conduct of the clinical trial. Thank you for Alina's talk and Professor Mahmood's talk with regard to access and research and converting research into policy for the low middle income countries. So there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, but we're getting there, and the pandemic has indeed taught all of us quite a bit. I think this pandemic has also given rise to many things. For example, the Cochrane tool with regard to detecting studies which are not good quality. I think that's something that's come about as a result of it. So thank you very much to all the panelists and the speakers, and I'll hand over to the Secretariat if they have anything to add on towards the end. Okay, Megan or Brenda, anything to add on, or should we go ahead and close?
We could go ahead and close. There will be a link to a survey to complete after the webinar, but thank you all for joining.
Okay. Yes, thank you, everyone. So please do look at the Coalition website, and there'll be a link to this webinar that will be provided there. And we look forward to continuing interactions with all of you. So thank you very much. Special thank you to all the speakers, and see you soon. Bye-bye.